for China-Philippines relations and the setting up of the award for promoting Philippine-China understanding and thus encouraging more people to join the endeavor of promoting the Philippines-China friendship by Apcu. On our part, our Chairman Emeritus, Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, said that the visit to the Philippines by the Chinese delegation shows China's confidence in the Philippines and the administration under President Duterte. The establishment of the Manila Forum for China-Philippines Relations by Apcu will help the two countries strengthen mutual understanding, boost mutual trust, and overcome differences. The Philippine people have high expectations for the award for promoting Philippines-China understanding, which is expected to further promote the friendship between the two peoples. She hopes that the two sides will work to constantly develop bilateral friendly cooperation, accelerate post-pandemic economic recovery, and continuously inject new vitality into the Philippine-China friendship. The Manila Forum for China-Philippines Relations is co-founded by the Chinese Embassy in the Philippines and the Association for Philippines-China Understanding, Apcu, aiming to build a new platform of dialogues and communication to enhance mutual trust, promote cooperation, and resolve differences. The award for promoting Philippines-China understanding was jointly set up by the Chinese Embassy in the Philippines and the Association for Philippines-China Understanding, Apcu, with the purpose of awarding and encouraging Philippine groups and individuals that are committed to the China-Philippines friendship and make outstanding contribution to enhancing mutual understanding between China and the Philippines and promoting China-Philippines relations. So, fellow members and friends of Apcu, we have a big job and responsibility in the months ahead to ensure that the Manila Forum for Philippine-China Relations and the launching of the award for promoting Philippine-China understanding is done successfully. So we have a long year to look forward to, and I hope we can all cooperate for the success of these two major endeavors of Apcu this year. And now, to proceed with our forum today, I will call on our Treasurer General Fernando Pache to introduce our guest speaker this afternoon. General?
Yes, Mr. President. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Again, welcome to Apcu's 7th Forum via Zoom. And the topic for today is about gains, challenges, and prospects for Philippine-China bilateral relations. Our speaker finished his degree in public administrations in 2004 and Master of Arts in Asian Studies in 2009 at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, Quezon City. He obtained his Master's of Laws at Peking University in China in 2015. He took up his graduate studies on defense, diplomacy, and development in 2018 at the American University in Washington, D.C., USA, and is presently pursuing his Master of Arts in International Affairs, also at the same university. Today, he is a research fellow at the Asian Pacific Pathways to Progress Foundation and a member of the Board of Directors of the Philippine Association for Chinese Studies. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to present to you our speaker, Lucio Blanco Pitlo III.
Thank you, sir, for that very generous introduction. Magandang hapon sa ating lahat. Good afternoon to everyone. Xiao Hao. So let me just share my screen. Can everyone see my screen? Yes?
No, not yet. No.
Oh, not yet. Okay, hold on. How about now? Can everyone see my the presentation?
Not yet. It's still. Yes, now we can see it. Yes.
Okay, okay. So before I would start, I'd like to again express my gratitude to President Jeffrey Nang for inviting me to be the first speaker for um, Apcu's online forum for this year. It's a great privilege, and I think it's a great challenge also for me to present on a subject that is both sensitive, promising, and also very timely and relevant these days. So, the subject of my short talk for this afternoon would be the gains, challenges, and prospects for bilateral relations of Philippines and China. So let me start by providing a brief outline of my presentation. So I'm going to start with some of the outlining gains in bilateral relations in the past recent years, beginning with 2016 onwards. So we would be looking at the both the economic and then the security, political, and diplomatic gains. And then we're going to proceed with the challenges in the relations. Then we'll try to look into some of the possible scenarios for bilateral relations going forward. So I think there's no question that in relation to economics, much has been gained on both sides since 2016. So here in this slide, I posed the question of what has China become for the Philippines in recent years. So since 2016, China has become the Philippines' largest trade partner, and we see China accounting for a major export market for the country, and China becoming the largest source of import also for the country. In terms of tourism, China's become the second largest source of inbound tourists. Of course, the pandemic last year affected the tourism flows, but in the years from 2016 up until 2018, and we would expect that after this pandemic, it's likely that if relations remain positive, there's optimism that this trend will be sustained. So the China market posted the largest growth rate among the foreign markets for Philippine tourism. And it started from a very low base. So we can see how the improvement in political relations really helped boost this important sector. Tourism is a very important and a very unique industry in the sense that it benefits big and small players. So from civil aviation to hotel to accommodation industry down to your souvenir shops. So it benefits both the formal and informal sectors. So this is a huge industry that is promised to grow more. Of course, China is now the largest tourism market in the world, and just shy of about 20% are traveling. So the opportunities are just immense. So in terms of investment, China has also become the second largest source of investment for the country, and it's also one of the fastest growing. In terms of aid, so these are both concessional loans and grants. China had become the third largest source of bilateral aid for the country. and is one of the fastest growing. So here we will see the countries, the Philippines' top export markets, and we will see the rise of China and Hong Kong. In terms of import sources, we also see the sharp rise of China as a top source of import commodities for the country. In terms of tourist markets, we also see the rapid rise of China, uh, catching very close to Korea, which remains the top market for Philippine tourism, but now by just a smaller margin. In terms of investments, China's investments has also grown in the country from a small investment back in 2016. You would see the figure uh, multiplied by several times. So the last figure that we got in 2019 was over 88 million pesos. These are approved investments. So in terms of bilateral aid, so China started from a very low base, funding just 1.56 million dollars of grants to the country back in 2016, to becoming the third largest after Japan and Korea, catching very close to Korea. So Japan is still the largest donor to the country, but of course there are several silver linings here. So for one, the Belt and Road Initiative of China announced in 2013. Of course, the creation of the China-led Multilateral Development Bank, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank in 2016. The first Belt and Road Forum for International Cooperation was convened in 2017, and the second forum was made in 2019. And of course, most importantly, China is a late player in the aid game. They created the China International Development Cooperation Agency back in 2018. So it's relatively new agency, um, and so there's a lot of promise for China in terms of providing aid and development assistance to developing countries in the global south, like its neighbor, the Philippines. So moving on to from economic gains and looking at security, political, and diplomatic gains, we see, of course, the efforts of both sides since 2016 to try to manage their disputes over the West Philippine Sea. Of course, both sides set up a bilateral consultation mechanism where they try to tackle intractable disputes over waters and features in this flashpoint. They already held 5 meetings, the last of which was held in Beijing back in October of 2019. The sixth meeting was supposed to take place in the Philippines, but because of the pandemic, that has to be put off. There's still no date set for the next meeting. Beyond the bilateral effort to manage disputes in the flashpoint, there is also the multilateral track. And the Philippines, being the ASEAN China country coordinator, has been playing an important role in trying to shepherd consensus among ASEAN member states in how to proceed with negotiations with China uh, towards a code of conduct for the South China Sea. And of course, there has been significant milestones made in recent years. A single draft negotiating text had been formed, and of course, the first draft of the text had been made last year. And during the visit of President Xi Jinping to Manila back in 2018, both sides had agreed for a memorandum of understanding on oil and gas cooperation in the South China Sea. That was in 2018, and progress on that has been took place. And of course, last year everyone knew about the lifting of the force majeure, the moratorium for upstream work in the West Philippine Sea. So this, of course, was welcomed warmly by the markets. So Philippine local energy players like Philex, their shares had risen because of this very positive development. And of course, there are also local oil and gas players that are now looking at ways to restart their work in this maritime space. And in addition, of course, there is also the effort on both sides to explore areas for non-traditional security cooperation. This, for instance, can be seen in terms of China's support for Philippine counterterrorism operations. If we recall back in 2017, when the Philippines are having difficulties trying to procure arms to fight against militants in Marawi, China as well as Russia had provided donated arms and ammunition to the Philippine military, and that enabled us to, of course, wrest control of this city from the clutches of the militants. Of course, also China provided construction equipment and also pledged to support the rehabilitation of Marawi. And of course, we know the support of China in terms of the Philippine war against the our fight against the pandemic. So since the early days, China had provided masks, of course, the protective equipments, medical supplies, lab equipment. They dispatched a team of experts to share their best practices in dealing with the pandemic, which was warmly received by our local experts. And of course, there's talk about a grant to support the Philippine pandemic response. And of course, on top of that, AIIB is also one of the uh, donor institutions that came forth to provide the country with a loan to support the country's pandemic response and economic recovery. Now, looking at the challenges in bilateral cooperation, of course, I have outlined some of them at the onset. So we have, of course, the disputes between both sides. So there's concern about the growing Chinese power projection in the flashpoint. Of course, there's worry about the possible impact to navigational and overflight freedoms, routine patrols, and resupply missions to our features in the Kalayaan Island Group, and of course to Panatag Shoal or Bahao de Masinloc. There's also concerns raised about a possible accident that may take place involving claimant states as well as major naval powers. I think the concern about a possible incident or accident involving major naval powers is the more uh, a bigger factor, a bigger concern for the country and also for other littoral states in the South China Sea. Of course, there's the factor of the public perception, um, the backlash from the offshore gaming industry, and of course reports of corruption involving some local authorities from customs to immigration, and of course some of the crimes being reported involving or targeting migrant Chinese workers that are presently working in the country. So this affects, of course, the image of Chinese migrants here, and of course the relations also is affected by such adverse perception. There is also concern about Chinese strategic investments, of course, in certain sectors from the power grid to the telecoms to the location or co-location of some of these investments near Philippine military facilities. So concerns have been raised in relation to those. And of course, also because this government has been at the forefront of improving relations with China, there is some perception that the present Duterte administration had been quite, or if not too accommodating to Beijing. Um, More challenges, of course. the great power competition between US and China, of course, presents the backdrop of the geopolitical landscape that has been changing in recent years. So there's much to be gained in terms of redirected trade and investment flows. So some of the country's neighbors like Vietnam, Thailand, and to some extent Indonesia and Malaysia are trying to catch in, seize opportunities from investments from US and other countries exiting China or expanding beyond China. Of course, that would necessitate investments in infrastructure, implement in logistics, and so on. So there's a possibility of gains in that, but maybe by and large short term. It may narrow soon, and I think that the larger concern about the decoupling of these two very important partners of the country and of the region, um, the impact of that in the supply chains. Of course, the Philippines plays a very important role in the global value chain, and any disruption on that will have serious impact in our economy. And of course, there's also a concern about the impact of possible decoupling between US and China and its effect in creating competing standards. So this would go across the board from aid to infrastructure to technology to cyberspace. So in recent years, we have seen these two rivals, of course, pitch their own ideas about aid, a lot of domains, and coming up with their own initiatives. And of course, they offer this to the world. And of course, the impact of this in terms of creating divergence when countries are supposed to be harmonizing, and that may have a long-term impact for the Philippines and of course for the world. Um, the great power competition between US and China may also constrain the room for maneuver of lesser states, small and middle countries like the Philippines. Of course, the pursuit of independent foreign policy made by this present administration may reach a certain glass ceiling if, for instance, the reaction of the US or sanctions being imposed by the US on companies of non-traditional partners like China and Russia, that would have effect on Philippine calculations. And of course, finally, and most importantly, because next year will be elections, there will be leadership change. I think the political risk and uncertainty that this would bring is a major factor that may, for one, diminish the momentum for Chinese investments and aid until the dust from the election settle. So it's possible that some Chinese investments may adopt a wait and see attitude, especially for big ticket projects. And secondly, the concern about the policy swings. This may impact, mega infrastructure projects that usually takes a lot of time to complete. So it would, of course, affect investor confidence if there will be sharp swings. And then it's possible that some capital or aid flight may happen if relations turn sour and disputes are not managed properly. So now going to some of the prospects for bilateral relations. So I identified three possible scenarios. So one is that politics may trump economics. The second is that there could be cold politics and warm economics. And then finally, there could be warm politics and hot economics. I think the audience may be able to see some permutations, or reconfiguration of these three. But let me describe them in brief. Now, so the first possible scenario is that the leadership change next year will might lead to a reversal of sort if disputes would be put as front and center of bilateral relations. So this may spill over to economics and may obliterate the gains made in recent years. So again, the gains that we had outlined in the early part of the discussion, early part of the presentation, all of those may, uh, there might be a huge shadow to be casted on those uh, solid and rapid gains in recent years. The second scenario is that both sides may adopt cold politics but still pursue warm economic ties. So under this scenario, the disputes will persist. I think there's no illusion that sovereignty disputes are always difficult to handle, and we are not alone in this predicament. Of course, China also has disputes with its other neighbors. We also have disputes with our neighbors also in relation to um, territories, overlapping maritime claims, and so on. So the disputes might persist, but the parties will give full play to established mechanisms. So if you will recall some of the mechanisms that we have outlined earlier, so this would include bilateral consultation mechanism set up in 2016, and of course the multilateral track where ASEAN, including the claimant states, plus the rest of ASEAN, working with China for a code of conduct on the South China Sea. So bilateral and multilateral tracks may be given full play. So despite of the disputes, they may have some occasional flare-ups, but overall the stability will be sustained because parties will agree to allow these mechanisms and institutions to mature by referring disputes to these mechanisms. So if we go by this, then there's a high probability that we may be able to compartmentalize the disputes so that they would not affect overall relations. So, in essence, economic ties will remain robust. The third scenario is there might be there's a possibility of a warm politics and a hot economics. So under this, parties to the conflict or to the dispute will try to downplay their differences and even try to explore spaces for security cooperation. This could come in the form of non-traditional security areas like counter piracy, counter terrorism, which already had precedents back in 2017, and even explore maritime scientific research or even, of course, maritime confidence building and even support for the capacity development of course, the Philippine military and the Philippine Coast Guard. So if this kind of activity would take place, there's a possibility that the economic ties, more than being sustained, they can even grow and expand. So these are some of the prospects that bilateral relations may proceed depending on several variables, one of which is the leadership change that will take place in 2022 next year. So I will end there, and I would be happy to take your questions. Thank you again for listening, and more power to Apcu.
Thank you, Lucio, for your nice presentation. We have gathered a few questions, and I would like to encourage the audience, the participants, to put in your questions in the chat. And now for a few questions. The Trump administration has been very much anti-China, even lifting the prohibition on American officials' visits to Taiwan, and thus starting a possible Cold War between China and the US. The Trump administration also had banned Huawei, TikTok in the US. So with the change in administration just yesterday, um, how do you think will this affect U.S.-China relations? And more importantly, how do you think it will affect Philippine-China relations?
Yeah, certainly. So I think there are certain variables that may be within the control of the country, like our bilateral relations with China. But again, there are external variables that may also impact it. Of course, I'm referring to the competition, the intensifying competition between our two most important partners on the economic and security side. So I think the inauguration of President Joe Biden yesterday may portend possible changes in America's China policy. And it remains to be seen how that would affect relations of other countries with China. But certainly, I think if U.S. and China would be able to manage their competition, I think that would be a good signal for other countries also to sustain engagement with both powers. I think the space for maneuver will grow as U.S.-China relations improve. Uh, that being said, I think there's no stopping countries like the Philippines, along with our ASEAN partners and neighbors, to do our part, to um, probably bridge differences between the two to the best of our ability. Probably ASEAN as a bloc, impressing on both China and the US, the importance of keeping stable relations um, for the stability, for the security and peace and prosperity of the Indo-Pacific or the Asia-Pacific, whichever way you want to call it. So I think this new administration every new administration will bring hope. Um, we have seen the potential for swings in U.S. policy towards the region and towards China. From the Obama administration, that is more that is seen as more multilateralist to a more unilateralist and an unpredictable foreign policy under the Trump administration. And apparently, there's some expectation that the Joe Biden administration may be a third Obama administration or an administration that may recommit the United States of America to globalization and multilateralism, and by so doing, reverse whatever Trump may have set forth. Again, the latest gambits, the latest activities and actions taken by the Trump administration before stepping down. Of course, much has been said that it might tie the hands of the next administration, force it to take a more assertive and forceful stance against China. But I think the next administration, there is no stopping it from pursuing its own policy. And I think there are some indications that spaces for cooperation between the two might take place. For instance, in the area of climate change, um, environment, in dealing with the Korean Peninsula, and who knows what other domains or spaces for cooperation might again be open.
Okay. We have a question from PCCI's Bert Phoenix. What concrete steps do you recommend for the Philippines to do in order to achieve the third scenario? And I believe this means whoever becomes president next year, we will continue to have warm politics and hot economics between China and the Philippines.
I think the three scenarios that I outlined, I think the second one is, I suppose many would aspire that it would be at least the bottom line, at least the minimum. Uh, and then I think the third one would be deal. I think that there needs to be a consensus among presidential aspirants, among the country's leaders who will assume the reins of power next year. No, I think it's important to reach a national consensus on how we deal with China. China again is a country that we cannot ignore. It is now the largest economy, by GDP purchasing power parity standards. There's a lot of forecasts saying that it may overtake the U.S. in a decade, or even before a decade. And of course, we have issues with China. We have disputes with China, but the economic dimension is something that we cannot ignore. Of course, the people-to-people ties are growing. So again, I think it's important for us to recognize our issues with China and not conflate that with other issues, and not conflate our issues with China with the issues of other countries with China. So I think it's essential for us to really identify where our national interests lie and to work with countries, whether it's China, whether it's US, if those interests converge, and be frank and candid to raise, issues when there's a need for them to be raised. Again, of course, there are many channels. There are many ways by which issues can be discussed. Of course, we have private channels. We have people-to-people contacts. They can be formal channels. So we can explore the whole range of channels to address disputes or to maintain communication, even during the most trying of times. And I think secondly, we have to learn from our neighbors. Again, the Philippines is not the only country in ASEAN, or not the only neighbor of China with which it has disputes with. But again, we take the example of Malaysia and Indonesia, even Vietnam. They have disputes with China over the South China Sea, but still they're able to keep robust economic ties, and they're growing. So I think it's important for us to take a cue, take page, from the lessons and experience of our neighbors when we try to deal, of course, with our largest trade partner and an increasingly important global player like China.
From our past president, Professor Gabi Lopez, the new U.S. State Secretary Anthony Blinken seems to support Trump's China stance. What happens if the U.S. will continue its insistence on decoupling the economies of both countries? Will the Philippines be forced to choose sides, between the U.S. and China? What are the implications on the Philippine diplomacy and economy?
I think that the more intense the competition between US and China, the more hedging other countries would up. Before the year ends, we have seen the conclusion of a China-EU investment deal, and I think this may portend EU, Europe as a whole, taking putting more premium on strategic autonomy, uh, taking its own in dealing with China. Of course, that would impact transatlantic relations between US and EU. I think there's some possibility of a reset with this Biden administration, but I think a very forceful and assertive, and no spaces being open for cooperation with China will also blow back. I think no country in the region, for instance, have intimated an openness towards choosing side. I think ASEAN's inclusivity, its open nature, we try to be the platform to engage middle and major powers far and wide, and we remain a platform where other players can project their own connectivity visions, their own visions for the region. but at the same time, we eschew, we avoid taking sides. That has been the nature of ASEAN. I think that will be the nature of ASEAN going forward. So the more intense competition US and China will have, and the more chances of conflict will arise because of that, the more countries will take matters into their own hands and pursue, try to diversify their economic and security partners. We have seen this, of course, under this present administration. Of course, the advertising had been, I think there's a lot of improvement that needs to be made on that part. But I think concrete gains are being made in terms of trying to uh, lessen our dependence on a limited pool of partners and try to grow it.
Okay. From Dr. Romel Banlawi, the President of the Philippine Association for Chinese Studies. Can you update us on the status of talks for the RP-China joint development in the South China Sea?
I think Professor Banlawi is more poised to share updates on that. I think both sides are nearing advancing their negotiations. I think the lifting of the moratorium underpins a certain level of agreement reached by both sides. The technical working groups, both at the political, technical, and even at the entrepreneurial working group levels had been made, and they had met several times. And so I think a possible commercial agreement between CNOC, the China National Offshore Oil Corporation, and local players like the Philippine National Oil Company or Philex Petroleum may take place. Now, I think China may project this as a joint development, and the Philippine side may project this as China being an offshore, a foreign energy contractor, um, being subsumed under the Philippine service contract system. So I think this would provide both sides leeway to, uh, to try to convince their domestic public about the importance of this deal, and that this deal would not affect their bottom line positions in the West Philippine Sea.
Okay. Again, from Bert Phoenix, how do you think can we resolve the West Philippine Sea dispute with China?
I think resolving it would be difficult, but I think in the interim, managing the disputes so that they would not cloud overall relations is important. I think this is the step being taken by our neighbors in relation to this flashpoint. Of course, many had mentioned that the 2016 arbitration award should set the cornerstone for Philippine dealing with China in relation to the West Philippine Sea. Again, how would the award be asserted, and how will it play a role in dealing with China would have implications, in our bilateral ties. So I think, as I mentioned earlier, there had been, and there's still an ongoing bilateral and multilateral tracks being opened to try to address this dispute for the time being, to try to manage them, maybe dial down tensions, allow for dialogue, but the I think it still remains like a holy grail. Like resolving this dispute is still not within both parties' reach, but making sure that they would not affect overall ties in itself is already a big achievement, in my view.
Okay, thank you. From Austin Ong, uh, you've studied in the top universities in UP Diliman, in Beijing, in Washington, D.C. Can you share how Filipino and American students view China vis-a-vis how Chinese students view the USA?
I think that's the hardest question. Um, I studied in these places in different times, and of course at different stages of the relations. So I think that may also affect how they perceive, their country's relations vis-a-vis uh, U.S. or China in the case of Chinese students, or vis-a-vis China in the case of American students. I'm studying in the U.S. Um, of course, at the current stage of the relations between US and China, of course, there's expectation that negative and adverse views about China dominate, I think, across the board, uh, whether it's in the security, policy, or academic circles. So, of course, this will uh, go down to students. This would affect how they see China, and of course, unfortunately, the fallout for people-to-people relations will be there. We have seen how Chinese students were, of course, affected. I mean, their studies in the U.S., their entry into American universities had been affected. We don't know if the coming administration will overturn that or may reopen spaces for scientific and academic and people-to-people collaboration between American and Chinese people and students. For Filipino students, I studied in China back in 2014 at a time when relations were at a really low point. But so far, I mean, back then, of course, there's concern about how will can relations go any lower than what happened in 2013. And I think my experience as a Filipino student in Beijing back in 2014 and 2015 was that, of course, as a normal student, I took my classes. Um, I had limited interaction with Chinese students because my class is, we are all white foreign students, and so I may not be able to answer, but in my limited engagement with my Chinese language partners and some Chinese friends, student friends. Um, of course, their perception of the Philippines was bad because of the arbitration case that we initiated in 2013, and of course because of the way the disputes has festered and how it affected the overall relations. So I think these are normal expectations to be made during those times.
Okay. Thank you. Again, from President Davi Lopez. On another matter, I heard from church insiders that in its desire to advance Vatican-China diplomatic ties, a Chinoy Filipino Cardinal Tagle, who is high up there in the Vatican, is expected to play an important role in the years to come. Would you like to comment on this?
Um, Sir, I have little information about this, so I'm afraid I may not be able to comment on that. My apologies.
Okay, okay, no problem. And then another question from Austin Ong. What do you think our Filipino universities need to do to better prepare our students for the new normal? I think this refers not only to the pandemic, but also to the prominence of the Chinese economy in the Philippines and the world economy in the years to come.
So I think it's important for us to invest in next generation, cutting edge technologies. I think countries are able to leapfrog, from a cashless society to, a society where you don't have to bring your wallet. You just use your mobile phone, and everything's there. So bypassing the credit card and going fully mobile and online commerce. So I think it's important for the educational system, um, the academic community in the Philippines to recognize the gains and inroads made by China in investing in vocational and technical education that enable them to support massive infrastructure projects advancements in science and technology and engineering. So again, I have nothing against liberal arts and humanities, but I think of course many countries are now investing in sciences, STEM, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So I think this is one domain that we can really seriously explore, uh, whether to reorient our education to capitalize on this coming opportunity. Again, the fourth industrial revolution is already on its way. It's full swing. It will not wait for us to adapt to it, and many countries are trying to jump on the opportunity and by investing in their infrastructure, both physical and digital, and of course social. So investment in human capital development is key. Now, services, sciences, technology, this would be the future drivers for development. If in the past it was resource-based commodities like oil, I think now it will be data, it will be artificial intelligence, it will be cloud. So all of this will affect everything from governance to doing business. So we have to be prepared for it. And looking into our educational system is a good starting point.
Okay. We have a question from Ambassador Benito Villaporta. Do you think that China and the US would be open to changing the ground rules of their zero-sum game, which could inevitably lead to mutually assured destruction? That means a nuclear holocaust.
I think there is a possibility that both sides might step back, from if they reach a certain stage of competition where the stakes have become really high, and of course when they see the reaction of third states. So I think countries like the Philippines, countries in ASEAN, can play a role in terms of again impressing on both sides the importance of keeping stable relations. U.S.-China relations is the most consequential. It's the most important bilateral relations in the world, and many countries calibrate their foreign policy and security calculus depending on the state of play between U.S. and China. So I think if U.S. and China realize that no countries are buying their, of course, their attempt to try to corral countries to form a coalition to put pressure on another country, then I think they may realize that it's more important to work alongside one another and also with other partners in reforming global governance, whether it's in trade, whether it's in aid and development assistance, whether in renegotiating cyber security standards or norms. So I think the third countries have a lot of agency to play, and they have to be wise in exercising it.
Another question is when the when President Duterte first went to Beijing in 2016, there was some $16 billion in investments supposed to be made by Chinese companies in the Philippines, and also something like $9 billion in loans and grants to the Philippines by China. Some would say that very few actual investments and loans have been delivered and have come into fruition. Would you like to comment?
Sure. So yeah, I think that has been one of the persistent criticism about the administration's strategy in dealing with China, and how it gave in too much and got too little. So we heard that oftenly. So, but we have to understand that, for instance, in relation to infrastructure projects, you know, very few infrastructure projects in the Philippines, especially big ones, large scale infrastructure projects, gets to be completed in a single administration. So it's important to, of course, have continuity for projects, but in so doing, we must of course make sure that we exercise due diligence. We have to undertake really thorough feasibility studies to make sure that projects will be viable and will redound to our benefit. Of course, we had some negative experience with some Chinese projects back then. So I think part of the time that we're now taking more to work with China was triggered by some of these experiences. So I think avoiding perceptions of corruption, making sure that terms are standard, the clauses for the agreement are standard, and they are all sound and above board. I think these are all considerations that are being made by the Philippine side. And on the Chinese side, of course, I think there's now more uh, greater internal vetting for Chinese contractors that are taking part in the build infrastructure projects in the Philippines. So I think both sides are trying to learn from past experiences and trying to take this as they try to improve, um, relations and try to work on joint projects. Again, some of the delays, some of the hurdles in relation to these joint infrastructure projects are bureaucratic, endemic to the Philippines. Um, of course, the bureaucracy of China is also large. As I said earlier, they just established an aid agency pretty much recent, in 2018. So again, these are all factors that have to be taken into consideration when we say that few of the promises or few of the pledges had been consummated thus far. I think, again, in the recent visit of State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi, he again expressed commitment of China to infrastructure projects, one of which was the Subic Clark Railway project. Again, back during the time of former President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, the North Rail project was touted as the largest ODA project of China back then. 16 years after, more than 16 years after, um, that project, which was canceled, was not, there was no alternative put to it. So 16 plus more years of commuters, uh, having to experience, the hardships of going to Bulacan or nearby provinces, uh, close to 2 decades of, the country, Manila, unable to decongest, by providing a more seamless transportation to connect it with northern provinces like Bulacan. So I think the lesson for us is that if ever we would have to, in working with China for infrastructure projects, especially for the next administration, if we see that some of the terms, some of the clauses are non-standard, unsound, there's always a room for us to renegotiate and again to review and hopefully to put the project back on track. I think it's a willingness that will signal that the Philippines is open to investors and that when foreign companies deal with the Philippines, they're dealing not with an administration that is only in for 6 years. And so if they contract agreement with the Philippines for projects that will uh, go beyond 6 years, they have a sense of reassurance that these agreements or contracts would not be arbitrarily upended for political reasons, for partisan reasons. So again, if we take the example, for instance, of the East Coast Rail Link project of Malaysia, that was negotiated during the time of Prime Minister Najib Razak. Of course, there's been a lot of concerns, a lot of comments that this project has been negotiated in bad faith, that there's been corruption. When Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad assumed the leadership in Malaysia, he renegotiated the project, and the project continued. And even after he stepped down, he was replaced by a new Prime Minister, Muhyiddin Yassin. The project continued. And to this day, uh, despite of the pandemic, work on the East Coast Railing project had continued. And very soon, this would be up and running. So I think this is a classic case that you know leadership change may pose risks to joint infrastructure projects, but if one is adept and willing to review and renegotiate with the end view of improving the contract if they think it's bad, then there is always the door open for both sides to work on whether it's infrastructure, whether it's other form of investment.
Okay, thank you. There are also those people, especially in the Western press, who point out the problems of Chinese debts incurred by Sri Lanka in big white elephant projects like port or airports. Do you think there's such a problem offing for the Philippines with this supposed debt trap by China? Would you like to comment?
Sure. I think the Philippine economic fundamentals remain strong. I think despite of this recession, many countries still remain bullish and optimistic about the prospects of the Philippine economy. Of course, Bank of China, for instance, will be raising its loan portfolio by 20%. In other countries remain um, they continue to invest in the country. I think if comparing ourselves with other countries that borrow huge sums of money from China, I think we are well positioned, and that provides us more caution in dealing with China for these projects. I think our capacity to pay and our willingness to pay is there, and that the next administration hopefully will uh, will sustain the momentum created by this present administration, especially in relation to infrastructure projects. So again, the build is something critical for us. Our neighbors have been raising up to develop, rebuild, and build their infrastructure because this is the only way for them to corner more foreign investment. So they have to improve the cost of doing business, lower the cost of power, utilities, of course, internet. We know where the areas where we are really lacking. So if we want to develop this, if we want to capitalize on the opportunities being opened by mobile and e-commerce, we have to invest in telco. We have to improve our internet services, and being open to investors, including China, is a big step for us to really improve those critical and strategic sectors. I think there are many ways for us to caution against possible risks. We do our due diligence, we negotiate well, and of course, we try to work with other partners. I think working in consortiums, for instance, is one way to dilute the influence of one, to prevent us from being overexposed to just one lender. We can bring in Korean, Japanese, and Chinese companies in a consortium. We can award one project to China, like the Subic Clark Railway, and give the subway, Metro Manila subway, to Japan. We give the Philippine National Railway South Railway project to China, and give other projects to Korea and China. So these are ways for us to spread our risk. So there are ways that can be done, that can be exercised, and we must exercise them fully.
Okay. Perhaps the most visible and concrete example, no, of a strong Philippine-China economic ties is the presence of POGOs in the country. Uh, what and how do you think could the government handle the POGOs, the presence of 300,000 Chinese mainland workers in the POGO offices? Could the government have handled it better from public perception point of view.
So yeah, I mean, I think the Pogo industry has been much criticized for a wide range of factors. One of which is, of course, that it's like a black hole where money laundering and other financial crimes and other crimes can take place. And of course, there's a concern about um, the space, the land space, uh, becoming more being overtaken. Now, the concern about um, Chinese buyers making the prices of rental space much higher, making it hard for middle class and lower class people to afford. But we cannot, of course, deny the gains from this industry if only it can be managed well. Again, I think the Philippines had become the third largest rental retail space in the world, and in no small part because of this offshore gaming industry. Of course, the Chinese side is trying to clamp down on this industry, and the Philippines exercising its sovereign sovereignty has been trying to push back on that. um, I think there are efforts being made by the government to make to regulate, the pogos and make them contribute more, to the country's national coffers. One of which is to improve the way taxes. I think the taxation issue is one, making sure that the pogos will pay their due and the loopholes will be addressed. The second is making sure that the immigration laws will not be compromised. Um, to welcome thousands of Chinese migrant workers. And the third, I think, is to improve law enforcement. I think the Philippine National Police are setting up Chinese language or bringing in Mandarin, language speakers to try to address crimes that are, targeting migrant Chinese or involving migrant Chinese. So I think these are steps in the right direction to convince the public that this offshore gaming industry is within the bounds of the law. They operate within the bounds of the law. They contribute to the country's national development. They pay their taxes. They make sure that their employees follow Philippine laws, respect Philippine customs and traditions. So I think there are efforts being done. Again, they're not perfect. This is a nascent industry. It's a new industry. We again expect birth pains. If we want to sustain this industry, and they would continue to call the Philippines home, a hub for their operations, we have to make sure that our law enforcement, our regulatory authorities, our immigration officials are all on board. In making sure that um, all of this are above ground legal, comply with our national laws, and most importantly, they provide benefit to our country.
Okay. From Napoleon Co, uh, any basis on the joint venture oil development in the South China Sea within our contested areas and with the Chinese companies as developers? I believe there's been talk of a 60-40 sharing. Would you like to enlighten us?
I'm not privy to the details, but I think I heard the 60-40 was proposed. I heard that the Chinese side has accepted. I think some reports are saying that there is tacit acceptance of the agreement, and that the Chinese player CNOC might become the partner of Philippine local players like PNOC or PXP or PHILEX for a possible joint exploration and even production in the area of direct to bank or feed bank. So these are being explored. Again, CNOC also expressed interest to invest in other offshore areas beyond SC-72 or the Recto Bank area, one of which is SC-51, which is more closer to Philippine waters. So I think the joint venture is being discussed, I think, privately by the concerned players because of the political space opened up. So I think because of the MOU on oil and gas and cooperation in 2018 and the lifting of the moratorium in last year, I think these are all signals that the private sector are trying to capitalize on. So we hope that this spaces will be sustained uh, beyond 2022. I think for now it's difficult for private players because of the costs involved in exploration works to really put their necks, so to speak. Um, so I think the continuity post 2022 will be critical in informing them of their next decisions.
Okay. We have a question from Joel C. Serrat. Can bilateral relations between China and the Philippines be encouraged and developed through Filipino-Chinese family plans in the Philippines and in China?
I think that is one important pillar, the people-to-people ties. I think the kinship and affinity ties between the local Filipino Chinese and, of course, the Chinese from China is one undeniable and very important pillar. Especially because the Chinese Filipino plays a very outsized, important role in Philippine economy. But I think it's also important for us to go beyond that and to try to involve mainstream Philippine society. I think APCU is doing its part in trying to promote people-to-people relations. I think it's very crucial for organizations promoting people-to-people ties to dispel the notion that this is just between local ethnic Chinese and mainland Chinese. And I think it's important to make it open and inclusive to for even mainstream Filipinos that have no Chinese blood, that are not of Chinese descent, that they can take part in these kinds of activities, which will redound benefit to them, whether through education, scholarship opportunities. um, you know uh, you know Me, for instance, as far as I can under recollect, I have no knowledge that I am of Chinese descent. But the scholarship opportunity that I received, having the chance to got the chance to study in China is an eye opener for me. It's a different thing to study China from the books, especially Western authored books, which make, of course, their own interpretations and, of course, their own views about China. It's different to study China there in China with Chinese professors and also mingling, interacting with ordinary Chinese people in everyday life. I think it's a uh, as they say, the taste of the pudding is in the eating. So I think experience is definitely the best teacher. So I think if we expand opportunities for Filipinos across the board, from all walks of life, from all statures, to take part, to participate in these kinds of people-to-people interaction, they would be very important. They would be the investment for long-term cordial relations.
Thank you. And of course, that is the role of Apcu, no? To be the primary people-to-people developer, no? Of relationships directly between Filipinos and Chinese through scholarships, economic, cultural, and even political ties. And so we've come to the end of our forum today, and we would like now to call on our Vice President, Mr. Felix Guanzon from Cebu.
Ladies and gentlemen, to end today's meeting, I would like to thank you for joining this forum, for taking your time out of your busy schedule. Your presence today shows a strong commitment to work toward the relationship between Filipino and Chinese people. In particular, I would like to express a sincere gratitude to the speakers for sharing their expertise with us. I hope many of you will be able to join again in our next forum and discuss the important issues we need to tackle. I guess that will be all for today. We look forward to welcoming you again. I would like to close my remarks and officially announce the end of this meeting. Thank you very much for your unwavering attention throughout this forum.
Thank you, Vice President Felix. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And I just would like to announce our next forum. We will have no less than Dr. Tina Clemente of the University of the Philippines, Diliman Asian Center, who will be talking about and comparing perceptions and empirics, China, Japan, aid and investment in the Philippines on February 18, Thursday at 3 p.m. So thank you everyone for coming and joining us today, and hopefully we can see you again